This is a fan-generated show. If you would like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com and also don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Good evening. Welcome to the Glazov Gang. Tonight, our very special guest, Dr. Sebastian Gorka, the author of Defeating Jihad, The Winnable War, and he is the professor of strategy and irregular warfare at the Institute of World Politics. Dr. Sebastian, what an honor and a privilege to have you on the Glazov Gang.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome, Dr. Gorka. Thank you very much. Just finished your book, Defeating Jihad. Want to talk about all the recommendations you give and some of the scary things that you talk about. But, you know, on the television, on a lot of the shows, often we don't hear, some people asking you about some of the very profound, touching things in the beginning of your book that I would like to start with. Your father, what an incredible story. Paul, you were born in, he was born in Hungary, a dissident, brave man, stood up against the communist regime. He was in prison, and then a certain miracle occurred during the uprising of 1956. Dr. Gorka, can we begin with that?
Absolutely, yes. My father was a teenager when Hungary was taken over by the Soviets and the Communist Party after World War II. He resisted in college. He created an underground movement against the communists. That movement was betrayed by Kim Philby, one of the 5 Cambridge Apostles, the Soviet agents inside MI6 in the UK. He was arrested at the age of 20 and given a life sentence in a communist prison. Then during the revolution, 6 years later, one of the units of freedom fighters captured a Soviet tank and used it to liberate the political prisoners from the Budapest main prison. And as a result, he escaped from communist prison, was asked by one of his fellow prison mates to take his 17-year-old daughter out of the country to the West. So my father escaped with that young girl across the minefield into Austria, ended up in a refugee camp, and eventually made his way to the UK with that young girl who would eventually become his wife and my future mother. I was born and raised in the UK to those Hungarian parents who'd escaped communism, and now I'm here in the United States and a proud American.
What a story, Dr. Gorka, and it's so obvious from your story and from reading your book that in many respects you're carrying the torch of your father's battle, your father's spirit. And I'd like to ask you this. We know that there's 100,000 things. Can you name us one thing that your dad did that left an indelible mark on your personality and your passion and what you fight for?
Well, that's easy. That's really what the opening of the book, Defeating Jihad. When I looked at the events of 9/11 happening in real time, I appreciated them a little bit differently, I think, than most of my fellow Americans. Because I had been raised by people who had escaped a dictatorship, I was inculcated from the earliest time I can remember with a very simple understanding that freedom and liberty is as precious as it is fragile. And the words of President Reagan ring true forever, that the loss of liberty is always but one generation away. So when those planes hit the Twin Towers, when that plane hit the Pentagon, for me, I understood that as the return of the totalitarians. These weren't fascists, these weren't communists, but the jihadis that endanger America today, groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, are just a new form of totalitarianism, in this case, a religiously informed one.
Thank you, Dr. Gorka. Now, before we get to that, in terms of your upbringing, growing up in England, and becoming a conservative, I think it would be fair to say, what is one book that you remember or an author that influenced your thinking?
Well, I was formed in the Thatcher years, and if there's I mean, there's so many books to talk about. The Road to Serfdom by Hayek. There was a book that was written after the events of the 1980s that I like to recommend to most people who didn't live through the Cold War, and that's the superb book by John O'Sullivan, The Pope, the Prime Minister, and the President, which is an incredibly readable text on the role of just three individuals: Margaret Thatcher in the UK, President Reagan, and then Pope John Paul II. That demonstrates how fortitude and commitment to the principles of liberty by just a few individuals can truly change the world and can do miraculous things, such as help the collapse of the Iron Curtain. So that's one book that truly stands out for me.
Thank you, Dr. Gorka. Now, another great book called Defeating Jihad. I mean, you crystallize some things that just unveil a catastrophe that we're witnessing right now. You're talking about the importance of labeling the threat that we face, and we've heard a lot about that. What really moved me in your book is you concretely point out that the government needs to lay down a vision, an actual threat doctrine analysis in a thorough document, just like George Kennan's long telegram, NSC 68. So, as you point out, these guys, these experts, these people, these documents, they defined the Soviet threat, and then they outlined a plan. We do not even have such a document in our hands. I mean, this is surreal.
Yeah, I mean, my book, I really cheat with Defeating Jihad because the template is there. The successful way to defeat totalitarians is given. And I use my template is the incredible pair of documents written by George Kennan and Paul Nitze. The first one is the so-called long telegram, that 15-page secret cable that George Kennan was requested to send from Moscow to Washington to simply explain what is communism and why is the Soviet Union such an existential threat to America. So that is technically what we call an enemy threat doctrine analysis. That's part one of any victory, understanding the enemy. And on the basis of that document, the game plan for defeating communism was written by Paul Nitze, and that's National Security Council document 68, a top secret plan that was now declassified. And I actually provide both of these documents in their original formats as appendices to the book. And that was the game plan written in the early 50s on what it's going to take to win the war against the Soviet Union, to undermine that globalist ideology of Marxism. And my argument in Defeating Jihad is, where's the long telegram for the jihadi threat? We still haven't written one 15 years into this war. And shockingly, the most powerful nation the world has ever seen still doesn't have a plan to win this war. And my book is one man's attempt to provide a game plan.
And what a catastrophe that we don't even have such a document, as you point out as well. We can't even, and the Obama administration refuses to even label our enemy. But now in your book, you discuss, look, we got to label the enemy. Then we got to come up with documents such as this to provide an analysis and a strategy. You also talk about a twofold counter-propaganda campaign. So crucial, because we don't engage in any propaganda. Only our enemy does. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so my plan has three elements. The first one you've already discussed. It's getting politics out of the threat assessment. No censorship, no politically correct matrix that forbids you to use the words the enemy uses about themselves, such as jihad. So number one is get politics out of the threat assessment. The second part is to empower our Sunni partners and allies in the region. I'm a white-skinned Catholic. I can go on Al Jazeera and debate the Muslim Brotherhood till the cows come home. But the really effective face of this war needs to be our Sunni allies, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the people who are really on the front line in the region. We have to help them delegitimize the jihadis, because they're not getting our help. They're being disregarded. Sisi has been completely dismissed by the administration, so they have to have the support of the White House on the next administration. And the flip side of that, the third element is, we have to engender, we have to execute a strategic level counter-propaganda campaign, mostly in the black area, the covert information operations domain, just as we did during the Cold War. During the Cold War, we spent billions on undermining the message of communism, of Karl Marx, and eventually it worked. On November the 9th, 1989, the people on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain took the Berlin Wall apart. That's what we have to do today, but it's going to require leadership for that to happen in Washington.
And a leadership that we do not have. It's a catastrophe. Dr. Gorka, who is Barack Obama?
You should ask him. I like to avoid the conspiracy theories, or the ideas about which God he prays to. You can't answer that question. I can't answer that question. Nobody can crawl into another man's soul. But I go with Dinesh D'Souza's incredible article, which he wrote, I think, 7 years ago at the beginning of the first administration. Barack Obama, just look at what he says and look at his background. Look at the influence of communists in Hawaii. Look at the influence of Saul Alinsky. Look at whose knee he bounced on as he was growing up as a child. And this is, as D'Souza says, the first post-American president. The great irony of the current commander-in-chief is we have a president of America who doesn't believe in America, whether it's the apology tour, whether it's the rejection of allies that have been at our side decades, whether it's the coddling up to rogue regimes like Iran. This is the point of view of the president and his coterie always begins with the same analysis, straight out of the most radical left politics. America is the problem. That's where they begin, and we must be punished, and we must be brought down to a level where we are no longer as powerful as we used to be. That's all you have to know about Barack Obama.
Wow. Sounds scarier than when I was watching The Exorcist when I was a little kid. Doesn't sound like this is a commander-in-chief, quote unquote, that wants America to win. Dr. Sebastian Gorka, before we go, just a few questions to wrap up. When you go to sleep at night and you think a little bit about Hillary Clinton leading the United States and trying to protect this country from the threats we face, what are some thoughts that come to your mind?
I don't have thoughts that come to mind. I have horrific scenarios of dying at the hands of an individual who cares not one whit for this republic or its founding principles, and who cares only about one thing, that's herself and the acquisition of power for her own criminal cartel, which is really what the Clinton enterprise is. The latest documents coming out of the State Department just today, it's clear this individual, whether you look at anything, whether it's Whitewater, whether it's Servergate, whether it's Benghazi, whether it's the Clinton Foundation, this woman is not interested in the Republic. This woman would lead us into even more Dantean infernos, would destabilize the world even further. This idea that she'd be more hawkish than Obama, no, she'd do whatever she thought was required of her to become more powerful and to make more money as she's doing it. I like not to think about those scenarios because they could be devastating to the future of our great nation.
And I think a word you used was horrific in terms of the scenario. Before we depart, Dr. Gorka, communism, jihad, comparison of threats to freedom in the United States. What do you think?
You mean historic communism or communism today?
I would say historic. During the Cold War, during the Cold War, the threat we faced, the threat we face now. How would you compare them?
The threat during the Cold War was a frightening one. You know, my parents were stockpiling food in the basement during 1962 in the October Cuban Missile Crisis. So yeah, it's scary because you had a nuclear standoff between two superpowers. But the bottom line was, no matter how scary it was, the enemy was a rational enemy. The enemy was driven by a logic that was based on survival. They knew that if they button, we would press the button too. So parents worked. On that level, the current threat environment is worse. It's scarier. If the jihadis acquire weapons of mass destruction, if the mullahs in Iran acquire weapons of mass destruction, there is no deterrent effect. They believe that Jihad is around the corner. They wish to apocalypse. The Shias believe in the occupation of the hidden imam. ISIS believes end times has begun because they've captured the territory of Al-Sham. So really, if you look at the threat of communism versus the threat of jihadism, I'm actually more concerned with the jihadi threat we face today. If your viewers really want to understand more, you don't even have to buy the book Defeating Jihad. Go to my website. Go to thegorkabriefing.com. That's TheGorka, thegorkabriefing.com, and you can download the jihad texts, what these people believe and what they wish to do to us, and they really should read it for themselves if they're at play today.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Gorka. Before we go, we would like to ask on just even a personal level, you ever go back to Hungary?
I have a few times. I'm an only child. My parents passed away more than a decade ago, so I don't have a lot of familial ties, but I went back for a business engagement earlier this year. So Budapest is a great city, so if your viewers haven't been, they want to consider checking it out.
But Dr. Gorka, in terms of matters of the heart, did you feel that you had come back home, or was it a bit foreign to you?
Well, I grew up in a very Hungarian atmosphere at home. I learned before I learned English. So I'm a strange Mischung. But as a good friend of mine, Heritage Foundation said one day, and I really have to concur with her, Sebastian, you were always an American. You were just born in the wrong place. So I'm an American now, and I think I always have been. And we have to save the Republic.
Yeah. But Dr. Gorka, the tragedy in my homeland in Russia is that the KGB mafiosa still remained in power. I think Hungary did a lot better after '89, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, Hungary actually had a certain degree of lustration. It wasn't the most effective. It wasn't like the Balts. It wasn't like East Germany, where all the files were open to public. But yeah, Russia is you've got a KGB colonel running the country. What more do we need to say?
Dr. Gorka, what a pleasure, privilege, and honor to have had you on the Glazov Gang.
My pleasure, anytime.
We hope to see you again. And our viewers, buy Defeating Jihad immediately, a must-read by Dr. Sebastian Gorka. Please remember, this is a fan-generated program. If you like the show, go to jamieglazov.com to support the show, and make sure you subscribe to the Glazov channel on YouTube. Good night.